Isn't it good to be here to worship the Lord? My, it feels awesome, doesn't it? Every Sunday I just come here. I thoroughly enjoy worshiping the Lord here. It's just a blessing. It feels so good to worship the Lord, doesn't it? We're going to read from the scripture this morning in the Old Testament. I just love the Old Testament. A friend of mine, he said that he always reads in the New Testament. And just recently he started reading the Old Testament. He said, and every time I talk to him, he says, "Man, is there a lot of stuff in that Old Testament?" I said, "Yes, sir, there is. There's a lot of good stuff in the Old Testament." Well, it's 1 Samuel. We're going to be reading from chapter 3, verses 1 through 11. This is where the Lord calls Samuel. The boy Samuel ministered before the Lord under Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here am I." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." But Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." So he went and lied down. Again the Lord called Samuel, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here am I, you called me." "My son," Eli said, "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel a third time, and Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down. In his place, the Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears of it tingle." That's a great word of God for the people of God. Yes. Praise the Lord.
Good morning, and I am very thankful to be able to be here today to share with you my testimony. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Reverend Violet Davidson, retired elder in the United Methodist Church. I'm a Christian. I am a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a sister, but first of all, I am a child of God, just as are each one of you. You may be thinking, "Oh no, just another story from some pastor who had a few troubles in their life and grew up in a Christian home, and here we go again." Well, I ask you to bear with me as I share with you some of my story. You see, my earliest memory was of my natural mother leaving and walking out on my father and all 9 of her children. I was too young to understand why she was doing that, and she was leaving with a man that I did not like, and I was crying for her to not go. I was not quite 5 at the time, and my natural father was yelling at my sister to shut me up or he would. She was leaving, and I couldn't understand it any more than my brothers and sisters could. What happened after that was that our father continued to drink more, abusing my brothers with anything he could lay his hands on, even a metal pipe, and abusing my sisters in ways I cannot mention in this setting. And through all of this, there were a series of moves which to me as a young child felt like was in the middle of the night. It was always dark. He was an itinerant farm worker, and somehow, even though my natural mother had notified the welfare that he was alone and abusing and had all the kids with him, and they kept trying to locate us, being an itinerant farm worker, he was easily able to move to another place. Then there came a time where we lived in a place that was actually a converted chicken coop. Half of it was for the farm hands, and the other half of it had the chickens. We lived in 2 rooms, and that was 9 children and our father. And in that area, there was a small table with a couple chairs, and there was a box spring, not the kind that you have box springs today, it was just springs in the other room. All of us girls slept on that with a blanket over the springs. My natural father slept on the cot, and the boys slept on the floor in the kitchen. In the middle of one of the nights we were there, we heard some terrible noise, and all of a sudden my sister, when I had woke up and was frightened, she says, "Shh, don't say anything, don't move." And in that same moment, one of my brothers had gotten a flashlight and saw a big white rat coming up through the floorboards, which they had to pound and pound and pound to get it back down and hammer that part shut again. That was just one of the many places that we lived. And one of the other places that we lived, as my father always did, he drank all his money. And he could be found drunk in the field, and a farmer would fire him. And it went like that, one after another. One day, we didn't have any food in the house, none whatsoever. So he made me go with him. And it wasn't winter yet, but he made me put on my sister's winter coat, so it was big and baggy. And he had me go with him to the grocery store that lived closest to our house. So we get there, and he asks the grocer to give him some more credit to feed his children. And the grocer said he couldn't give him any more credit. So my father told me to walk in front of him, and we walked out the back door. On the way out the back door, he grabbed a box of Rice Krispies off the shelf, and he said, "Hide this under your coat." And I did. And that was our meal for supper and our meal for breakfast the next day. Then he was gone again. And my aunt somehow found out that we were there alone and didn't have any food in the house. And she came, she brought a little food, but then she said, "I'm going to do something more for you." And we couldn't figure out what she was going to do, but as it got evening, what she did was showed us how to raid garbage cans for our food. And we found in that one garbage can a lot of potato peelings. And I have to tell you, that was the best meal I'd had in a long time. She also taught us how to beg for crusts of bread from the neighbors' houses. After running for about a year, we had moved to the top floor of a farmhouse. My brothers had been taught how to shoot and go out and get deer so that we would have something to eat. And they warned all of us little kids not to play with the bullets. Well, they had left a blank cartridge on the floor, and so of course I was playing with it. And when they said it was time to go to bed, I just sat it on the bottom of the wood stove. That night the house caught on fire. I thought it was my fault. I had no idea that that blank cartridge wouldn't have caused a fire. I was 30 before I found out the truth. So there was a firefighter that got injured that night. It was a chimney fire from the potbelly stove. The welfare finally caught up with us, and we were all taken to the Randolph Children's Home. We thought it was a wonderful place, better than any place we had ever lived. And we thought, of course, that we would all be together, but that was not the case. We were separated out. Myself, my brother, and my youngest sister went to one home. The older 2 sisters went to another home, and the 4 boys went to another home. We were split up, and we never saw each other for many, many years after that. I was devastated. I couldn't figure out what was wrong with me, that first my mother left, then my father had to leave, and then we were separated from our siblings. It was terrible. But in this first foster home that we were at, my sister, 3 years old, got pneumonia. And the foster mother, the only person she could get to take her to the hospital at Jones Hill, rode a motorcycle. And she was in the bathtub, my little sister was, because she had an accident, and they were trying to clean her up, and then she fell and hit her head. So for many years, I thought that it was that damage to her head that had killed her. Luckily, there was a person in another church who knew that his grandmother had us in her home, and he brought me the death certificate, and it said pneumonia. That helped me to forgive that person, because for a long time, I thought it was her fault. So my younger brother and I were sent to another foster home, and that mother got ill and couldn't keep us anymore, so we went to another foster home. That was a farm in Fredonia. We didn't stay there very long either. Then we moved again to the home of a Nazarene minister and his wife that lived in Brockton. And we were there for 3 years, which was an absolute amazing thing. I remembered as a little girl there, some of the things my foster mother said to me. Don't you wear lipstick. Don't you smoke. And she would say it that way every Sunday to every child in the Sunday school. I don't think I ever smoked, and I think it was because of that. But anyways, one day the social worker came to the house, and they wanted to adopt me, Reverend and Mrs. Kaufman, but they didn't want to adopt my brother. So my mother said no. Shortly after that, she got remarried. Social services went and checked out their home, told them the things they had to change, and checked it again and said, okay, the kids can come and live with you. Well, unfortunately, from the first day that we were there, my stepfather did to me things that no father should ever do to a child. And when I finally got the courage to ask my mother why, she said that I had to let him because otherwise we wouldn't have any food to eat or any clothes to wear. The day came that I had to run away. My younger brother had taken his shotgun and put it at the back of my stepfather's head and told him to leave me alone, but I knew he wouldn't. So I ran down the hill to the constables and told them what was going on. Well, my stepfather was a great person in that town. So all he did was take me to a neighbor's to spend the night. And of course, they had 8 kids of their own, and they couldn't keep me living with them. So they told me I had to talk to someone at school. And at that time, I was still praying. I remember one time I put a sock outside the window and said, God, if you're here, I need you to make this sock dry in the morning, and I'll know that you are here with me. And of course, that didn't happen. It's just not the way God works. But God did work that day when I went to school. And I remembered that principal, the first year I was there in Youngsville School, he said, I want all of you to know principal means more than just being someone that is in charge of this school. It means that I am your pal. He said the last 3 letters of that principal is pal. And I remembered that. So I went to the office and I asked to speak to the principal. Of course, this young girl what's she got to ask the principal about, right? So the secretary said, write it all down, and we'll call you when he's ready to talk with you. I was on pins and needles all day long. Finally, my name came across the PA announcement, and I went down to the office. And he asked me to tell him about this letter I'd written him. And so, even though it was hard for me to start, when I started, it just all poured out, and I told him everything that was going on. And then he stopped, and he said, have you heard enough? And I couldn't figure out what he meant by that. And in the other room that I couldn't see her was my caseworker. So back into the welfare I went again. That time, I was only there to finish out the school year and a little bit into the summer because, luckily for me, there was a couple that had a camp across the street from where my stepfather lived. And they didn't have any children, weren't able to have children. And when they found out that I was in another foster home, they called me one night at that foster home and asked me if I'd like to go to dinner with them. And I said, yes, I certainly would. That was great. Never been to dinner with anybody. So then they asked me if I'd like to come and live with them. And I said, yes, absolutely. Who wouldn't, you know? So I went to live with them. In the process, we had to go to court, and my mother had to answer the judge when he said, why didn't you stop what was going on? And she said, well, I'd rather take care of, or no, she said, I would rather have a roof over my head than take care of this brat. In just that way. It was devastating, but I knew she meant it. So they were awarded guardianship of me, and I call them my parents. My mom still lives in the house she was born in, basically, in Lakewood, has her own apartment there, and our daughter now owns that house. But I began ninth grade at Southwestern, and we lived right next to the old United Methodist Church that was right there in Lakewood. It was adjacent to the property. And they would have Sunday school down at the new part, and then they'd have church at the old part because the church wasn't all built yet. And so my parents would sit out there in the summer, and they'd be drinking their beer and carrying on and talking to the people as they came out of church. And I didn't go to church anymore. They didn't want to go to church. I wasn't going to church. And they'd say, hey, come on over and have a beer. And that was what our Sundays were like. So whoever wanted to come over and have beer with my parents did, or whatever else they brought to drink. But my constant prayer was, okay, I was torn away from my family. I was torn out of up to 10 different homes. And why? I felt like I was dirt under someone's feet. I wasn't worth anything to anybody. Well, after high school, I decided to run away to Florida with somebody I had met who said he loved me. And I did. I ran away. My parents didn't know where I was. Finally, they had police out looking for me and found me in Florida. Excuse me. So then, when I got in contact with my parents, they said, okay, then we're taking your car back because, you know, they had financed the car and I wasn't making the payments anymore. I didn't have any money to make them. And so we moved. This man I was with and I moved to another area. And he got a job at a trucking company and I got a job in a factory. And I didn't know it for a long time, but he started playing the field. And so then, by God's grace, I had met a woman who was a very nice Christian. And I told her, all about my first husband, because eventually he did marry me because he promised he wouldn't do anything like that again. And I spent a lot of time with her and her husband. He was a Baptist pastor without any type of credentialing. He was like an itinerant pastor. And he worked and preached at this place that was a rehab place for drug addicts and alcoholics. And I would go to church with him sometimes. He'd bring me to church. And so I still didn't know why I was being treated like I was by this person that was supposed to love me. But one day I realized enough was enough, and I couldn't live with this person anymore. In fact, I figured that if that's all I was worth to anybody, it wasn't worth living. So one day I decided to take everything that was in the medicine cabinet, and I did, literally. And in that process, I felt what I can only describe as a guide that took my hand and was taking me across a hanging bridge. And I could hear these horrible screams below the bridge. And I started to look down, and he said, "Don't look down, just look forward." And as I looked forward, I saw this beautiful light. It was just the warmest, most loving light I had ever seen in my life. And I said, "Oh, can I stay here?" The guide had brought me to the other end of that bridge, and I heard a voice that said to me, "No, you cannot stay. Your work is not yet done." Well, believe me, I could not figure out what that meant. And I heard my guide say, "You have to go back." I said, "I don't know how to go back." He said, "I'll show you." And quite literally, I saw myself laying on the bed, and he said, "Put your hand in your hand." In other words, my spiritual hand into my physical hand, and I snapped back into my body. These are not made-up things. These really happen. So I kept praying to God, when am I going to find the person who's going to love me for me, not the way that all these other people have treated me and said they loved me, but the one that was really meant for me? Well, as I said, I got divorced and came home in September of '74, and there was a friend of mine from high school whose husband worked with this guy named David. And we decided that she would fix me up on a blind date with this guy. Well, when you're in the service, if your name has more than one syllable, it's shortened to the first part of the name. So this guy's name was David to everybody. And David was short for Davidson. So I met my husband that night. He had gotten home from the service in July of the same year. And when we met each other, we knew that we were meant for each other. Craziest place we've ever been in our lives is where we went for a dinner. And believe me, it's gone now, and I'm glad of it. We never would want to go back there again. But we talked. We had gone to breakfast at my friend's house, and we decided just to go outside and talk on this November night. And we did. We talked for several hours, and we found out about each other. He had been through a divorce when he was in the service. So we knew that pain, and we knew what we wanted in life for ourselves and for each other. Well, my mother just thought it was fantastic that I'd found this really nice guy, and she wanted to plan this big wedding that would take all of Lakewood, and and we were trying to pay for it. So we finally said, no, we just can't do this. So we upped the date of the wedding. Now, we met November 15th, 1974. We got married January 10th, 1975. That was how sure we were that we were the right one for each other. Well, we attended church, tried to live the way that we should. Randy's family were part of the Lutheran church. And I became pregnant right after we got married. And then came the fateful day that the obstetrician told me that I would have to get used to it because I was going to lose the baby. I had toxemia. I had to stay flat in bed for the rest of my pregnancy. And I was so brokenhearted. I said, how can this happen? How can any more things happen that are so devastating, that are so horrible? But that night, I prayed and prayed, and I received a vision. And I didn't mention the first vision I ever saw, so I'll tell you that first. The first vision that I saw was when I was crying out to God about what was happening to me in that home of my stepfather's. And he gave me a vision of men on a battlefield. And he said, I cannot make people do what they don't want to do, but it breaks my heart. And I knew then he was talking about my stepfather. Well, this time, this vision was completely different. I had a vision of us bringing our daughter home. And I held on to that vision with all that I was worth. That vision showed me in a wheelchair. There were balloons on the wheelchair. Randy was holding the flowers, and I was holding our baby. And we were coming home. And I just knew it was this baby I was carrying. So one day I started having contractions, and I knew it was way too early to have contractions, so I figured it was Braxton Hicks. Randy was at college at the time, and when he came home, I said, well, I've been having contractions, but I'm sure it's nothing. It's just those Braxton Hicks contractions. During the night, it got a lot worse, so I ended up going to the hospital. And when I got there, the obstetrics nurse said to me, oh, now, honey, don't worry. It's going to be a long night, and it'll be okay. And I looked at her, and I said, no, she's coming now. And she was. And I was back in the room, where the delivery room, and Randy was able to go with me because we'd taken Lamaze classes up until we had one left, but they let him come in anyway. The difficult part of that whole story is that our first daughter was born not alive. And they thought at first that was the only baby. But I had all these straps wrapped around me to try to monitor fetal heartbeat, and one of the nurses started to take them off, and then she says, wait a minute, I think I hear another heartbeat. And Kim was born. Our daughter, Kim, came home with us. But it took a while. She was only 4 pounds, 11 ounces, and of course, babies drop right after birth. She couldn't suckle. She had to be cavaged with her tube down her throat. And so after 2 weeks, I was discharged because I had to get over all the stuff from toxemia. And then still 2 weeks, and she still couldn't come home, according to the doctor. But I was tired of going to the hospital 3 times a day to feed her. And so I decided one day I was bringing my baby home. So Randy and I went to the hospital. I had already packed her bag, and Dr. Furlong happened to be the doctor at the time, God bless his soul. And he said, no, don't don't get too anxious. You go home and you get her stuff ready, and I'll let you know if she can come home. I said, her stuff is all ready. It's in the car. She's coming home with me today. He said, well, now let me just have time to check her all out. I said, okay, you do that. And I was serious because I was bringing my baby home, and so was Randy. He was right there with me. So we brought our baby home, and we had to go back in a week to the doctor. She'd gained almost a pound, and the doctor was so thrilled, and he had been so worried about letting her come home. But our daughter Kim grew up and became the wife of our son-in-law Peyton, and has three wonderful grandsons. I can't talk today. So 3 years later then, we had another daughter, Jessica. She was the adventurous type. She'd run off in a store, and you couldn't hang on to her, loved her money. And we'd finally catch up to her. And then one day we decided, okay, we've had enough of this. So she decided she was going to go to the candy bin that was there, and we told her to come with us out the door, and we thought she was following, but she wasn't. And then she tried to go out the other door, and I heard her cry behind me, and I thought, okay, I'm going to let her stand there for a minute and teach her not to do that anymore. So we did that. But then we'd find her climbing up her dad's ladder when he was working on the roof. I was like, oh my gosh, Then one day, she was playing out in the backyard. Randy and I were working in a rock garden, and Kim was out there, and her friends were out there. And she's supposed to be playing right there with us, and all of a sudden we realized she wasn't right there with us. So down to the road she'd gone, and she's sitting on this stone ledge that was next to the road, just dangling her feet. And I don't know how I finally thought of the road, but it was by God's grace that I got down there in time, and she didn't have any problems, because Lord knows what could have happened. Well, our life went along pretty smoothly, and Randy enjoyed roughhousing with our kids, and then one day, PTSD kicked in big time for me. I didn't even know what was happening. All I know is that Randy was trying to get me to come out of the closet and to stop crying and to stop screaming. And he finally got me out of the closet. And then I knew that I needed to have counseling. I wasn't over what I thought I was over. So I did that, and Pastor Jerry Ward was one of the people that helped me. I worked full-time as an operation manager at Zayre. I don't know if any of you ever remember Zayre in the plaza there where Walmart is now. And Zayre closed, and then Ames took over. And it wasn't too long before Ames closed. And the new company wanted me to go on the road for them as a trainer, because that's what I did. I was the one that trained all the staff and, hired them and did all that stuff. And so I said, no, my daughters were too young. I wasn't about to go anywhere on the road and leave them at home. So I ended up being an internal auditor for the length of time that Ames was there, and then I became a dislocated worker. So what that happened was I got to go to JCC basically free. I think it cost us all $500, and that was it. Got my books free and everything. So I thought at that time that I was going to work in an old folks' home or something like that and do activities with them. That was what I thought I was going to do. So I get a call after I'd been working during the summer at the Resource Center. My teacher at JCC called me and she said, "Vi, I've got the perfect place for you." And I said, okay. And she said, "It's the Agnes home." I said, all right. Well, being the person that hired and terminated and everything else, I knew how to look up information about any place, right? Only there was nothing about it. All I could find out about the Agnes home is it had 8 beds. I'm like, okay, I don't know why she thought this was going to be a good place for me, but I went to the interview anyway. And as I was sitting there waiting for another person to come out from the office in their interview, I realized that this was a domestic violence shelter. And I realized that I was meant to be there. So I went in when it was my turn, and Carolyn was the manager's name at the time, and she said, okay, Violet, why are you here? I said, well, I looked this place up and down. I could not find anything about it, didn't know what it was till I got here, but I know that God must want me here. She said, are you sure about that? I said, yeah. She said, okay, you're hired. That was it. Okay, you're hired. She says, I've got to be gone for a couple weeks, and then when I come back, I'll get you started. And she said, then I'm retiring, and you can take over. That's the way it went. And so for 4 years, I managed the Agnes home, and then the state asked us to take on other types of abuse victims. And so it was 24/7 on call for all of us and all over the county, and you had just so many minutes to get there. And one day I realized, okay, I have learned what I needed to learn here, and it's time for me to move on. And the person who had hired me, she had said to me one day, she said, you know, Vi, you should be a pastor. I'm like, yeah, right. And Jerry Ward, when I started working as the Christian education coordinator at Kidder Church, he kept putting local licensed pastors' brochures on my desk. Then I kept putting them in the garbage can, wasn't interested, that wasn't me. And then one day, Bill Ward came and talked to me and Randy, and he got Randy to go to Koinonia, and then, of course, I went 2 weeks later. And you know that quiet time you have at Koinonia? Well, I knew then that God was calling me to be a pastor. I was scared out of my mind. I'm like, I am not smart enough. I don't know enough about the Bible. How on earth could I be a pastor? But I knew that was God's calling, because he had given me a vision there when I was sitting there meditating. And it was this wall of water that was coming at me. And he knows how frightened I am of water, because I was resuscitated on the Fredonia area beach one day. And ever since then, I couldn't even watch our daughters learn how to swim at the Y. I'd have to have Randy come with me, and I'd say, okay, tell me when they're coming up out of the pool so I can wave and say, oh, you did a great job, you know? But when that wall of water was coming toward me, there was also something that I can only describe like a piece of plexiglass that enveloped me. And it went right over me, and then the wave went out. And when the wave went out, I saw all these people floundering in the water. And the only thing next to me was this old boat with a hole in the bottom and a rusted coffee can that you could bail it out with. And I didn't know how to swim. I didn't know how to do anything with the boat. But I got the meaning. God wanted me to go out and save others, to let them know that they are a child of God. No matter what you've done in your life, when you ask God to forgive your sins, you are forgiven. Do you turn around sometimes? Yeah, we all do. But then you get back on the right track again, and you are forgiven. And God makes you stronger every time that you have to go through hell on earth. That is why God sent me here, sent me back to do this job that I had not yet finished. And I don't know when it'll be finished. Only God knows that. But today, I want to ask all of you to open your hearts, to think about another person that you know has gone through terrible things in their relationships and in their lives. And I want you, as the musicians come forward and the ushers are taking the offering, come forward and pray. For God wants to hear your prayers. He is here with us right now. One of the things that I want to say before I give the benediction is that there was one more vision that God gave me, and it was of the cross standing on the hill. And on the back of that cross, there was a sign that just was waving, and I knew that I had to go up and see what that sign said. This is what it said: Jesus died for you too. That means Jesus died for every one of us, and we are all a child of God. I want you to remember, as you go forth, there are other people you know, people in your life, people in your neighborhood that need your loving touch, the touch of Jesus in their lives. Go forth by the power of the Holy Spirit and reach out to another person. Amen.